The woman had been preparing for 3 days. She ironed her dress twice. She arrived before the church opened. She stood in line for 4.5 hours in the cold of February, the kind of foggier cold that comes up from the earth and settles in the bones. And when she finally knelt in the confessional, when the wooden grill was all that separated her from the man people were already calling a saint, she said the words she had rehearsed in her bedroom every night for 2 weeks. She said everything, or almost everything, and Padre Pio went quiet. Not the quiet of a man thinking, the quiet of a man seeing something. Her name was Beatrice Ferrante. She was 55 years old, a widow from Foggia, and she had been carrying something for 14 years. She had not confessed it, not because she did not know it was wrong, not because she could not find a priest. She had not confessed it because somewhere in the soft and reasonable part of her mind, she had come to believe, slowly, almost without noticing, that God already knew, that God already understood, that he would not hold a good woman accountable for something she would deal with when she was ready. She had told herself this so many times, with such genuine faith, that it no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like trust. And Padre Pio, who could see what others could not, looked at her through the confessional grill and said nothing for a long moment. And then he said, "Those are not the words of a woman who trusts God. Those are the words of a woman who has decided what God is allowed to ask." She did not understand at first. By the end of that afternoon, she would understand everything. "My name is Margaret Ashford. I am 62 years old, from Coventry, England. I spent 23 years as a district nurse before my knees decided they had quite enough of stairs and night shifts. I have been studying and sharing Padre Pio's spiritual legacy for almost a decade now, and I want to tell you something before we go any further. I have said those words myself, not in a confessional, not even consciously, not always, but in the quiet of my own mind, when something was asking to be dealt with and I was not ready to deal with it. God will understand. He knows my heart. I will get to it when things settle down. I know what that sounds like from the inside. I know how reasonable it feels, how sincere it can be, and that is exactly why what I am going to share with you today stopped me in my tracks the first time I encountered it. There is a phrase, or rather a family of phrases, that Padre Pio identified across 5 decades of sitting in the confessional as one of the most spiritually dangerous patterns he ever witnessed. Not because it sounds like rebellion, not because it sounds like pride or malice or unbelief, because it sounds exactly like faith, because it is spoken by people who pray every day, who love God, who are genuinely trying to live well. And that, as he explained to one woman on a cold February afternoon in 1954, is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Stay with me, because before I tell you what Padre Pio saw in Beatrice Ferrante's soul, I want to tell you about a letter he wrote in 1921 to his own spiritual director, because in that letter he used a phrase in Italian that his translators have struggled with ever since. And when you understand what he meant by those words, the rest of what I'm about to share will land very differently than if you heard it without them. The phrase is this: La misericordia come refugio, mercy as a refuge. He did not mean it as something beautiful. Hold on to that. We will come back to it. He did not call it a single sin. He called it a spiritual posture, a way of relating to God's mercy that inverted its nature without the soul ever intending to do anything of the kind. You know the phrase already. You may have thought it yourself this week without noticing, without any intention of harm. You may have heard it from someone you love, spoken with complete sincerity as something that sounded like peace with God. God will understand. He knows my heart. I am not ready yet, but I will get there when I am. God is merciful. He would not want me to suffer over this. I will deal with it before I die. There is still time. These are not the same words, but according to what Padre Pio expressed across decades of private correspondence and confessional testimony, recorded by the brothers who lived alongside him and preserved in the archives of San Giovanni Rotondo. They function in the same way inside the soul. They invoke the mercy of God, not as a door to walk through, but as a ceiling to stop at. Not as something that opens the soul toward God, but as something the soul uses to make peace with staying exactly where it is. And what Padre Pio could see, because he possessed the gift that his church has called the reading of hearts, was what happened to the interior life of a person who had been living under that ceiling for years. It was not darkness, it was not rebellion. It was something harder to address than either of those things. It was dimness, a slow, comfortable, well-intentioned dimming of the soul's awareness, not a rupture, a settling, the soul settling quietly and without drama into the shape of the thing it had decided God would eventually overlook. Now I need to take you back to Foggia, to the February cold, to a woman named Beatrice, kneeling at a confessional grill, finally doing what she had been telling herself she would do for 14 years. Beatrice Ferrante had been born in Foggia in 1899, the third daughter of a schoolmaster and a woman who made lace. She had married at 22, a quiet man named Vittorio who repaired clocks. They had been happy, or something close to happy, for 18 years. Then Vittorio died in 1940 from something that began as a cough and ended in the way such things did in those years. And Beatrice became a widow at 41, with a small apartment, a modest pension, and the particular silence of a house that had once had someone in it. What she carried for 14 years, the specific sin she had not brought to confession, is described in the archive in careful terms that protect her privacy, and I will not specify it here. The specific act is not the point. The point is the structure of what grew around it, the spiritual architecture of the trap, and that is exactly what Padre Pio spent the better part of that February session helping her see. She had entered the confessional carrying a sin she knew she had committed. She had known from the beginning that it was wrong. She had not intended it as something serious, but in the way that serious things sometimes happen to people who only intended small ones, it had grown. Not in repetition, but in attachment. It had attached itself to her sense of self, to her understanding of who she was, to the story she told herself about the circumstances that had led to it. And over the years, the specific act had become less important than the habit of carrying it, the habit of telling herself, with genuine and sincere faith, that God, who knew her heart, who had seen everything from the beginning, was not pressing her on this particular point. She described those 14 years in her testimony like this: "It was not that I forgot what I had done. It was that I had organized my faith around it. I prayed every day. I went to Mass without fail. I said my rosary. I gave what I could to the poor. I tried to love my neighbors well, but there was a room in my soul that I did not enter, and I had decided with great sincerity that God, being good and knowing all things, did not require me to enter it just yet." She entered the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo on the 4th of February, 1954. She had risen before dawn. She had stood in the cold for 4.5 hours. When she finally knelt at the grill, she began with the prayers as she had been taught, and then she told Padre Pio about her husband's death, about the years of loneliness, about the prayers she had said, and the charity she had given, and the ways she had tried to live well in a difficult life. And then, at the end, she told him about the things she had not confessed for 14 years. He listened in silence. When she finished speaking, there was a pause, and then Padre Pio asked her a question she was not expecting. He said, "Before you decided to come here today, in your own mind, how did you explain to yourself that God had not asked you to come sooner?" She recorded this in her testimony. He asked it gently, not as an accusation, more the way a careful doctor asks about a symptom. He genuinely wanted to know the answer, and she said, "I told myself he understood, that he could see the circumstances, that I would come when I was truly ready, that it was not yet the right time. Padre Pio said, "I know. I have heard those words in this confessional more times than I can count. I have heard them from women who prayed faithfully every day, and from men who fasted every Friday, from priests, from a bishop, and every time I hear them, I see the same thing on the soul." She asked, "What do you see?" And this is the passage from her testimony that I have returned to more than any other sentence in a decade of reading these archives. He said, "I see a room that the person has closed. Not in anger, not in pride, not in malice of any kind. They have closed it because they have decided quietly and charitably toward themselves that God has agreed not to open it. But he has not agreed. He is standing at that door, and what you call his understanding, his patience, his mercy, is not his permission. It is his grief." I have to pause here for a moment, because when I first read those words, they did something to me that I had not expected. I have spent 23 years as a district nurse. I know what it looks like when someone's body has been quietly failing in a way they have decided not to notice. I have sat across from patients who explained very calmly and very reasonably all the reasons they had not come to a doctor sooner. The timing was not right. Things were too busy. They did not want to worry anyone. They expected it would resolve on its own. And there is a particular expression that comes across a person's face when the test results arrive and reality is no longer avoidable. It is not anger at first. It is not even fear. It is something that looks like recognition, the particular look of someone who has, on some level, always known. Beatrice described the same thing. Sitting in that confessional, she said, "It was like recognizing something I had always been aware of, but had organized my days around not seeing. And now I need to tell you what Padre Pio did next. Because he did not move toward absolution, he continued. And what he said next is the part that reaches into the very common ground where most of us, if we are honest, are standing. He said, "I want to tell you about 3 others. I will not use their names, but I want you to see something." The first was a man he described as genuinely devout, a man who attended Mass every Sunday without exception, who prayed the rosary, who gave generously to the poor. This man had a real debt, a financial obligation to a family member that he had not settled. He told himself he would settle it when his own circumstances allowed, when the moment was right, when he was not placing himself under undue strain. He had been telling himself this for 11 years. In confession, he would speak of his impatience, his occasional vanity, his distractions during prayer. He never spoke of the debt, because the debt in his mind had been placed in a different category, a category where God had agreed to wait alongside him. The second was a woman who had not spoken to her sister in 17 years. A real injury had occurred, a real wrong committed. She had decided, and she had prayed about this. She had genuinely brought it to God more than once, that he could see the full extent of the damage her sister had caused. He would not require her to extend forgiveness before she was ready. The forgiveness was coming. It had always been coming. She simply needed more time. The third, and this is the one that made Beatrice weep when Padre Pio described him, was a man who had quietly distanced his children from faith. Not through arguments, not through declarations or dramatic scenes at the dinner table, through a sustained tone of gentle skepticism, through selective absences, through the way he received religious topics with a kind of polite weariness that communicated, without ever stating plainly, that such things were for simpler people than himself. He had never said he did not believe. He had told himself, and genuinely believed, that God, being just and loving and far beyond human categories, would not hold a man accountable for a temperament he could not entirely help. God understood nuance. God understood the complexity of an intelligent man's interior life. Padre Pio told Beatrice, "I have seen what came from that man's children. 2 of them no longer practice the faith. One tells anyone who asks that there is no God, And this man, who is still alive, still believes that his situation has been placed in a special category of divine understanding. Beatrice asked, what happened to the first two, the man with the debt and the woman who could not forgive? Padre Pio said, both came back, eventually. Both came through the door. But it cost them much that did not need to be spent. And then, the third one is still waiting. And then he said the sentence that she placed at the center of her testimony. The sentence she repeated to the sisters at San Giovanni Rotondo who recorded it. The sentence I want you to carry with you for the rest of this recording, and perhaps a good deal longer. The mercy of God is not a waiting room, it is a door. And a door requires that you walk through it. The souls I have described have stood outside the door, warm in the knowledge that the door is there, and the doorkeeper is good. And they have confused the warmth of standing near the door with the grace of being inside. They are not inside, they are outside. And the longer they remain outside, telling themselves the door will always be there, the less they remember what it feels like to be inside at all. Now I need to tell you about the letter. In the summer of 1921, Padre Pio wrote to his spiritual director, Father Agostino Daniele. It was a private letter, part of what became the collected correspondence known as the Epistolario, preserved in the friary archives and eventually published in 3 volumes in Italian. The letter was not written for anyone's benefit except Father Agostino's, which means Padre Pio was working through something he genuinely needed to think through, not for an audience, but for himself. He writes, I have been reflecting on a particular spiritual condition I encounter often in the confessional. The souls who carry it are not dishonest people. They are not hard-hearted. In many cases, they are among the most sincere believers I meet, people who pray with real devotion and live with genuine moral seriousness in most areas of their lives. But they have found, or rather constructed without knowing they were constructing anything, a way of relating to God's mercy that is not the same as receiving it. I can only describe it as la misericordia come refugio, mercy as a refuge. He continues, mercy received passes through a narrow point. It requires the soul to name the specific wrong, to accept the specific correction, to pass through the specific humiliation of returning to the exact thing God is asking it to return to. This is not a comfortable passage. It is designed to be uncomfortable, because what comes out on the other side of that discomfort is not just forgiveness, but transformation. The soul that passes through is not the same soul that entered. Mercy used as a refuge requires none of this. The soul remains where it is. It is warmed by the thought of God's goodness, sustained by the knowledge that He is loving and patient, and will not condemn a soul that truly means well. And it continues exactly as it was, in the same configuration, carrying the same burden, telling itself with perfect sincerity that the God who made it loves it too much to press very hard on the specific point it has deferred. And then Padre Pio writes the sentence that I cannot stop returning to. The danger of this condition is not that the soul is bad. A bad soul at least knows itself. The danger is that the soul is comfortable, and a comfortable soul does not feel the cold of being outside. A comfortable soul does not feel the door. I want to share something personal here, because I think it matters that I am not presenting this from the outside looking in. About 12 years ago, my husband David was very ill. He was going through a long and exhausting course of treatment, and everything in my life had compressed down to hospital appointments and test results, and trying to keep things as normal as possible for our daughters. It was a period of genuine difficulty, the kind of difficulty that organizes everything around it and gives a person a kind of permission, without anyone granting it formally, to defer things that would otherwise require attention. There was something unrelated to his illness that had been waiting for my attention for longer than I could quite account for. Not a large thing in the formal sense. but something real. And in the logic of that particular season, I had sorted it into the category of things that God, seeing everything I was carrying, would not be pressing me on just then. He understood that I did not have the capacity. He knew my heart. He could see I was doing what I could. I believed that completely and sincerely. And the thing sat there month after month and did what deferred things do. It calcified. It became less visible, not because it had gone away, but because I had arranged my days so that I did not have to encounter it directly. It was a priest at the hospital where David was being treated, a visiting chaplain from Birmingham named Father Bernard, who said something to me that I did not understand for 2 weeks. He said, "Margaret, you manage very well under pressure. You are very capable in a crisis. The thing to be watchful of is whether you use the pressure to manage God." I smiled and said thank you, because I thought it was a compliment about my resilience. 2 weeks later, driving home from a particularly difficult appointment, it landed. I understood what he had meant, and I understood with a clarity that was not comfortable exactly what I had been doing with the season of difficulty I had been given. I had been using it to manage God. What Padre Pio describes in that 1921 letter as mercy used as a refuge, what Beatrice Ferrante organized her faith around for 14 years, what the man with the debt and the woman with the unforgiven sister had, each, in their own way, constructed quietly and without malice, I had also constructed, in miniature perhaps, but the same shape, the same architecture, the same comfortable ceiling where the door had once been. Now I want to make sure you understand the actual spiritual mechanism, because I think the temptation, when hearing something like this, is to reduce it to a call for more frequent confession or more rigorous self-examination. And while those things are not wrong, they are not quite the center of what Padre Pio was describing. The center is what happens to the soul's perception over time when it lives in this posture. He did not say that using God's mercy as a refuge makes a person evil. He said it makes a person comfortable. And that comfort, sustained over months and years, produces a specific effect. The soul loses its ability to feel the difference between the warmth of the room it has built and the warmth of the house it was invited into, between the peace of standing near the door and the grace of being through it. The person prays. They mean the prayers. They attend the sacraments, perhaps. They live with real moral effort in every area except the specific one they have deferred. And because all the other areas feel genuine, and because the deferred area has been quietly reclassified as something God has agreed to set aside, the soul begins, over time, to experience its spiritual life as essentially whole. Not complete, but whole, the way a house can feel whole when one of the rooms is locked and you have stopped registering the locked door. What alarmed Padre Pio most, across all his years in that confessional, was not the initial act of deferral. He understood why people deferred. He understood grief and pressure, and the specific difficulty of certain confessions, the specific weight of returning to something you have been carrying for a long time. What alarmed him was what happened after several years of the arrangement. He wrote to Father Agostino, "The soul begins to perceive its own mercy posture as spiritual maturity. It mistakes the calm of avoidance for the peace of resolution. It mistakes the absence of urgency for the presence of grace. It begins to feel that because it has lived so long with this arrangement without obvious catastrophe, the arrangement must have been accepted. It looks at its own patience with itself and calls it God's patience with it. And the two, while they may feel identical from the inside, are not the same thing at all. I have a particular priest I go to now, Father Declan, originally from County Clare, who has been at the same parish for 30 years. He has a gift for saying things very quietly that you find yourself unable to unhear. I told him once about this concept, the idea of mercy as a refuge rather than mercy as a door, and he said, the person who stands outside tells themselves the door is open. The person who stands inside knows it is open because they have walked through it. The difference between them is not belief, it is passage. And then he said, the mercy of God is not a waiting room, it is a door, and doors require movement. I had not shared the Beatrice Ferrante story with him. He arrived at the same image entirely on his own, from 30 years of sitting with people in his own confessional. Something in that convergence has stayed with me. I want to take you back to Beatrice now, because after Padre Pio explained what he saw, after he told her about the three others, after he gave her the image of the door and the grief of the God who is standing at it, he did something she was not expecting. He gave her instructions. He told her that what was required was not simply a confession of the original act. The original act was where it had begun, but 14 years of the arrangement had created something additional that also needed to be brought into the light. Not just the thing she had done, what she had done with the doing of it, what she had built around it. The years of telling herself with perfect sincerity that God had agreed to an arrangement he had never been consulted about. He said, you must confess not only the act, but the habit, not only what happened, but what you have believed about God's relationship to what happened. Because the presumption, the quiet, sincere, faithful presumption that he would wait for you indefinitely, is itself something that has been placed between you and him, and it must be named. He told her to return to confession within the week after she had spent time in reflection, not more time arranging. Reflection. Looking honestly at the shape of what had grown over 14 years, and being willing to describe it to God not as a circumstance, but as a choice. And he gave her a prayer to say each morning for 40 days. It was not a complex prayer, it was not long, but I want to share it with you exactly as it appears in her testimony, because I believe the words are precise in a way that matters. She recorded it like this. He told me to say this, Lord, I do not ask you to forgive me for being imperfect. I ask you to forgive me for deciding what you would forgive me for. I ask you to forgive me for using your mercy as a substitute for your mercy. Open the room I have closed. I cannot open it without you. I am not ready, and I am asking you to make me ready, because left to myself, I never will be. She said that prayer every morning for 40 days. She told the sisters who recorded her testimony that for the first 2 weeks she could barely finish it without weeping. Not from fear, from recognition. The recognition of someone who hears, in words spoken aloud, the exact shape of something they have been doing for a long time. And then, around the 3rd week, something shifted. She described it like this. I stopped praying it from grief and started praying it from desire. I stopped wanting the prayer to be finished and started wanting it to be true. She walked out of the confessional that February afternoon and said that the air outside the church had weight. Not the weight of oppression or guilt, the weight of reality. The feeling of a person who has been living inside a carefully padded version of the world and has stepped for the first time in many years into the actual air. She returned to San Giovanni Rotondo 3 times in the following years. She lived until 1977. In her final interview, recorded just 3 years before her death, she was asked what those 23 years after the confession had felt like compared to the 14 before. She said, before I prayed a great deal and felt very little. After, I prayed the same amount and felt everything. The difference was not in the prayer, it was in the room I was no longer carrying. I think about Beatrice often. I think about the 4.5 hours she stood in the cold, finally doing what she had been telling herself she would do for 14 years. I think about the way Padre Pio did not simply absolve her and send her on her way. He stayed with her in the discomfort of understanding. He helped her see not just what she had done, but the shape of what had grown around it. He gave her words she could use to dismantle that shape, not through force of will, but through honest daily return to the God who had been standing at the door the entire time. And I think about Father Agostino reading that letter in 1921 in a monastery somewhere, understanding what Padre Pio was working through. Understanding that the most dangerous spiritual condition is not the dramatic one, not the rebellion or the apostasy or the spectacular fall, but the comfortable arrangement, the well-organized faith with one room closed that nobody mentions. Now I want to speak to you directly, not as someone who has studied these archives, as someone who for a period of her own life organized her faith around a room she was not entering. If you have been listening to this and something has been quietly uncomfortable, if some phrase or some image has landed a little closer than you expected, I want you to know that what you are feeling is not condemnation. It is not Padre Pio judging you from across the centuries. It is something much simpler and much more personal than any of that. It is recognition. The soul knows. It has always known. What it learns to do over months and years of telling itself a reasonable story is to stop attending to the knowing, to reclassify it, to put it in the category of things God has agreed to defer. And the mercy of God, which is real and genuine and the most beautiful truth in all of Christian faith, is not the reason the knowing went away. The mercy of God is what has preserved the knowing through all the years of arrangement, waiting for a moment exactly like this one when you are somewhere listening, and a woman from Coventry is reading you a letter a Franciscan friar wrote in 1921, and something in you says quietly, "That is me. That is the room I have not entered." The good news, the specific and practical and immediate good news, is that the same thing is offered to you that was offered to Beatrice Ferrante. Not eventually. Not when you are ready, as you have defined readiness. Now. The door is not closed. It is standing open. What Padre Pio gave to Beatrice, he gave to the man with the debt and the woman with the unforgiven sister, and would have given to the father whose children had drifted if he had come through the door himself. He gave it to everyone who arrived at that confessional grill and was honest about what they had been doing with what they had been given. He gave them the grace of a specific return, not a general resolution to do better, not a spiritual commitment to try harder at the broad level, a specific return to the specific room, named specifically, held in the hands and offered specifically to the God who has been standing at the door of it, not impatiently, not angrily, but with the grief of someone who loves you too much to walk away and too much to break the door down. Now, I want to say something to those of you who have been with this channel for some time, to those who have written to me, whose notes I have read late at night, whose stories of what these recordings have opened in them I carry with me. To those who are not merely watching, but have become part of what this channel is trying to do. This recording took a great deal of time to prepare. The research through the archival testimonies, the correspondence, the process of finding the right words for something that matters as much as this, is not a small undertaking. And this channel, which carries no advertising and no commercial sponsors, exists entirely because of the people who choose to support it directly. If you have received something from this recording today, if something Beatrice said, or Padre Pio wrote in 1921, or the prayer he gave her in 1954, has reached something in you that you did not expect to have reached, I want to ask you something. Beneath this video, you will see a super thanks button. If you feel moved to use it, here is how I want you to think about what that means. It is not a payment for content. It is a participation in the mission. Every person who uses super thanks makes it possible for the next person who has been living with a closed room in their faith to find this recording. Every act of support means that the story of Beatrice Ferrante and the letter Padre Pio wrote to Father Agostino and the prayer he gave her on a cold February afternoon in 1954 reaches one more person who needed to hear it and had not yet found it. Some of you have written to tell me that a recording from this channel led you back to confession after years away. Some have written about a relationship that changed. Some have said it helped someone they love die better than they would have died otherwise. I do not share these letters publicly, but I carry them, every one of them. And I want you to know that if you support this channel today, you are part of those stories too, not as a spectator. As one of the people who kept the door open for someone who was about to walk through it. If you can support with super thanks today, whether it is a small amount or the most generous one you can offer, I receive it with real gratitude and with the knowledge of exactly what it makes possible. And if you cannot support financially, your presence here and the way you carry what you have heard today into the rest of your week is also a form of support I receive with gratitude. Thank you. And now, before we close, I want to invite you to do something. I am going to read you that prayer one final time, and then I want to ask you a question in the comments. Lord, I do not ask you to forgive me for being imperfect. I ask you to forgive me for deciding what you would forgive me for. I ask you to forgive me for using your mercy as a substitute for your mercy. Open the room I have closed. I cannot open it without you. I am not ready, and I am asking you to make me ready, because left to myself I never will be. The question I want to ask you is this: is there a room? You do not have to name what is in it. You do not have to tell me or anyone else the specific thing. But I am asking you to be honest with yourself right now, in the quiet of wherever you are. Is there something that has been waiting? Something you have built a reasonable story around? Something you have told yourself God understands, and He does. He understands everything, but His understanding is not the same as His permission, and you have been perhaps for a long time confusing the two. If there is, write something in the comments below. Not the thing itself, perhaps, but something honest. This community will hold what you share, and if this recording has reached something in you today, type the word door. Just that. I will know what you mean, and so will you. Now I want to leave you with something to carry. Padre Pio said that the most misunderstood attribute of God among sincere believers is His patience. People interpret His patience as agreement, as endorsement, as evidence that the thing they have been deferring is, in some sense, also being deferred by God. But Padre Pio said patience is not absence. The patience of God is the patience of someone standing at a door, not pressing, not demanding, not threatening, standing, waiting, not because He has agreed to wait indefinitely, but because He loves you too much to stop waiting before you are ready to move. The question Padre Pio asked Beatrice Ferrante in that February confessional is not, "What have you done?" He already knew. He had already seen. The question he asked was, in your own mind, how have you explained to yourself that God agreed not to ask? And the deeper question beneath it, the one he was helping her toward, the one I want to leave with you, is this: it is not whether God will understand. He already does. He understands everything about you, every circumstance, every difficulty, every reason, every year of reasonable arrangement. The question is what you are waiting to understand about yourself. The door is there. It has always been there. It is open.